This episode of Mossback is presented by the Crosscut Festival.
It was a heist. This guy was clever. He thought of doing something in a way that other people hadn't thought. I just think there was partly the timing, partly the fact that it wasn't for political purpose, just made it more broadly appealing to Americans. Mm-hmm. And then you add the mystery on top of it, and you've got all the ingredients you need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for a true crime obsession. Hey everybody, welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from KCTS9 and Crosscut. I'm Sarah Bernard.
And I'm Knute Berger.
And this is our very first episode, a deeper dive on the first episode of the season of Mossback's Northwest, the story about D.B. Cooper.
One of the Northwest's greatest mysteries is about a skyjacker who called himself Dan Cooper.
Which, by the way, you really should watch. If you haven't already seen it, we suggest you stop right now, go to the show notes or the show page at crosscut.com and check it out. Okay, so D.B. Cooper, November 1971. He threatened to blow up a plane flying from Portland to Seattle unless he was paid $200,000 in $20 bills.
He lowered the stairs of the airplane and jumped off with the money in a parachute into the dark, stormy night. To my mind, his outrageous crime is not even the most odd thing about his story.
So I have a confession to make. D.B. Cooper is not just a hero in the Pacific Northwest. He's actually nationally known and is kind of a legend. But before I watched this episode of Mossback's Northwest, I confess I didn't even know who he was. Apparently there are lots and lots and lots of popular culture references to this guy, and I missed them all somehow.
Well, yeah, D.B. Cooper, the interesting thing is that everybody knows D.B. Cooper and nobody knows D.B. Cooper. I mean, that is sort of the central conundrum that keeps people so engaged. So it was essentially a robbery, like an old-fashioned robbery in the sky. And this was a novel thing to request, in addition to the money, parachutes. And he asked for 4 parachutes, 2 reserves, 2 main chutes. And they say that they think he did that because he wanted the FBI to think he would jump with a hostage so they wouldn't sabotage the parachute. So he thought this thing through in some ways, and he ended up being able to jump off the plane while it was at 10,000 feet in the midst of a thunderstorm somewhere, it's believed, over southwest Washington, although there's debate about exactly where. And as far as officialdom knows, he was never seen again. That was it.
I mean, I guess as someone who kind of came of age around September 11th, I mean, one thing I think about a lot when I hear this story, too, just the premise, that's the idea that somebody could pull that off. It just seems impossible now. That wouldn't happen. They don't even let you bring toothpaste, Yeah.
We live in a different world, of course, 9/11 really changed how we fly and all the protocols, and we have sky marshals now and all these things. But in the late 60s and early 70s, there was just this rash of hijackings. There were, in the 4-year period between 1968 and 1972, there were like 130 U.S. planes were hijacked. So it was almost like an epidemic of hijackings. And some of them were for political reasons. In some cases, they were for the money.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So hundreds within a few-year period. Is it almost like something people came to expect? They heard it so much in the news kind of thing?
Well, that to me was one of the very interesting things about D.B. Cooper is that, first of all, you don't invent a folk hero before the fact. People are going to respond to something, and they're going to respond with horror or judgment or whatever. In D.B. Cooper's case, whatever his style, his technique, his look. In fact, he was, drinking bourbon and soda and smoking cigarettes in a kind of madman suit in the back of the plane. I think it just hit a mood that when you look at what people had to say about it at the time, it wasn't, oh my God, this is a terrorist. It was, this guy's cool. this guy is, I want to be him. I want to, I think anybody that can steal $200,000 and nobody gets hurt, I don't want him to get caught. So there was this kind of immediate fan club for D.B. Cooper, even though he was, breaking all kinds of laws and rules of society.
Right. And I guess that, I can sort of see the appeal in the way that we love true crime stories, but the amount of attention, it turns out, not from me, apparently, because I didn't even know who he was. But in my ignorance, I did a quick Google, and I was just kind of blown away.
The FBI now checking out a new lead in the baffling disappearance of the daredevil thief called D.B. Cooper.
Was this mysterious D.B. Cooper?
The crime was perfect if he lived and perfectly crazy if he didn't.
I'm the case agent for the D.B. Cooper case out of the FBI's Seattle office.
This is the man who pulled off the only successful skyjacking in U.S. history.
A scientist has uncovered microscopic evidence in the unsolved case of D.B. Cooper.
D.B. Cooper.
D.B. Cooper.
D.B. Cooper.
Well, it's interesting because, it had these elements of the crime, had the elements of the mystery, the disappearance. It also happened at a time when, a lot of anti-establishment activity was going on in terms of, protests against the war in Vietnam. And, there's a sociologist at the University of Washington who said this is the sort of anti-establishment figure, a guy showing that one person could defeat technology. And so I think there were a whole lot of cultural things that made it particularly ripe. And then you add on to the fact that everybody is an amateur sleuth.
Yeah.
The FBI put out a reward. They began combing the woods to find the body or find out where he landed. And they weren't successful. And so the folk, people, have filled that gap.
They were looking for him. They couldn't find him. And so there's this enduring mystery. And so maybe, the other 100 and something skyjackers in those times, maybe they didn't disappear. So you had a resolution to their stories or something.
Well, that's true. Your point about being found is really interesting because one of the suspects, a guy named Richard Floyd McCoy, did a copycat hijacking of a plane just a few months later with a parachute, demand for money. He got $500,000, got his parachute, jumped out of a 727 with a rear stairway just like D.B. Cooper did. And he made it to the ground and was caught and ended up going to federal prison. Okay. And there are people who believe that he was D.B. Cooper.
And the evidence that I've disclosed to you, in my view, would have a fair chance of convincing a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that it was McCoy who committed the Cooper hijacking.
In other words, that D.B. Cooper failed the first time, succeeded the second time, and ended up being caught. And there's kind of a whole saga around that. People can, go on YouTube and see a whole thing. But nobody remembers him except that he might be a D.B. Cooper, but nobody's talking about Richard Floyd McCoy as this archetypal, perfect skyjacker of our times.
Wow. Yeah, because he was found.
Yes, yeah. He was caught, apprehended, tried, convicted, sent to federal prison. Now, later he broke out of prison and then was killed in a shootout.
Wow.
And but there were some former FBI agents who wrote a book saying that he was, he was a major suspect. They believed he was D.B. Cooper and that the FBI hadn't looked into the fact that this might have been a second try.
And I can tell you from 20 plus years in the FBI that if, in fact, we could have made McCoy as D.B. Cooper, we would have done it. End of story.
There were copycat cases that came after D.B. Cooper. People tried the same thing. And there were various responses to that, one of which is this thing called the Cooper vein. Have you heard about the Cooper vein?
No.
So when we were filming our episode, Stephen Haig, our producer-director, we had to find 727s because we wanted to film on a 727, and we wanted to show how the stairs worked. And we actually found 2 727s, one at the Museum of Flight, and it was a perfectly preserved, like, 70s interior. And then we found one up in Everett that Everett Community College uses to train aircraft mechanics on. So the plane is completely stripped out, but the rear stairway works.
Oh.
And so one of the things we learned was that after the hijacking, they came up with this little piece of metal that rests near the back stairway. And when the plane takes off, like a little weather vane, this metal moves and it blocks the stairs so they cannot be opened in flight.
Ah.
And so that was one of the responses was, well, we're going to make it so no one can, pull the stair trick again. So when they landed the plane, the money was gone. But in 1980, a kid down in Southwest Washington on a beach called Tina Bar on the Columbia River found a bunch of his money in these ratty, deteriorated bills. And so, the amount of money he asked for, I looked this up, $200,000 in $20 bills weighs about 22 pounds.
Ah.
So he's jumping at night. He's got to somehow attach this money to himself and hold on to it while jumping off with a parachute that's going to open very rapidly in a very high wind, high airspeed conditions. So there are a lot of reasons to think that he might not have made it. He wasn't able to see the ground. How did he know exactly where to jump?
Mm-hmm.
All that kind of stuff. And of course, that just adds to the mystery. It adds to the kind of glamour of the whole thing. So, and only part of his money was found. It was right. I think about $5,800 worth, something like that was found. The bills were rotting. They were still in their original rubber bands. So you have people who think, well, he dropped the money, that it washed downriver and then washed up on this little bar where it got kind of buried in the sand. And this place is a place where a fair amount of debris from the Columbia River, washes up. Or did he land and bury it there? There are different things. But I think it's pretty clear that he was separated from at least part of the loot.
Mm-hmm. For example, they didn't find the bag that the money was in. It was just these bills.
Yeah. And they were, they identified the bills from the serial numbers, but the rest of the serial numbers have never shown up. So either they were laundered more thoroughly than one could expect them to be laundered, or they were never spent.
Huh. Anyway, so this is why people obsess over D.B. Cooper, because there's so much unresolved. His body was never found. The other money was never found, never spent.
I tend not to get into all the different theories about who was D.B. Cooper, because, there have been deathbed confessions, families coming forward saying my father was D.B. Cooper, or my uncle was D.B. Cooper. It reminds me, of who wrote Shakespeare. It's like you'll never convince the Francis Bacon people and the Marlowe people and all these different people that they didn't write Shakespeare. And the same is true, I think, with a lot of the people who've invested literally decades researching, coming up with their own theories, tracking down their, suspects.
Hello, everybody. Today is November 24, 2021. That means it was 50 years ago to today.
Just this past Thanksgiving, November 2021, is the 50th anniversary
Tonight
of
is the
skyjacking.
50th anniversary of one of the most infamous and unsolved mysteries in the Pacific Northwest ever.
In my Googling, I learned that, of course, there is an HBO documentary about this guy that actually just came out.
When he got on a plane in Portland, Oregon last night, he was just another passenger.
I've only seen the trailer, but it seems like the filmmakers got a hold of some of the people who you mentioned had these sort of fingering their relatives or deathbed confessions.
There are thousands of people who say, I know who Cooper is.
I believe it's my dad. I know my uncle.
And this is something I just really want to put a fine point on. Like, not only do we have a deathbed confession, but we have more than one deathbed confession. I mean, that just is amazing to me, that the level of attention on this one guy, that people wanted to be him, that they on their deathbed would say, I am him, but more than one.
Yeah, I know that kind of thing is surprising. And a lot of the folks have been putting all the time and energy into it. You know, they're not doing it at this point. Nobody's doing it for a reward. And, of course, the statute of limitations on the piracy charges have expired, although there's a thing called the Hobbs Act, which he would still be liable under. But if the age prediction, of the witnesses that D.B. Cooper was in middle age, his mid-40s, he'd be in his mid-90s right now,
right?
If he were alive. But I think, some people, they just don't want an unanswered question. Part of the human imagination is wanting to put two and two together and have it make four. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a big part of what's going on. They have conventions where people come, their annual events where people show up.
Mm-hmm. The CooperCon. That's another thing right. I found.
CooperCon. Tell us about CooperCon. Where are we and what is CooperCon?
CooperCon2021.com. I mean, people are still talking about this today.
We're at the Kiggins Theater here in Vancouver, Washington.
The CooperCon 2021 speakers list includes Bill Mitchell, passenger on Flight 305, who sat directly across the aisle from D.B. Cooper, a host of a D.B. Cooper podcast. It's called the Cooper Vortex Podcast.
That's a great name. Well, it's we were talking about people going down a rabbit hole. It's sort of Alice in Wonderland. I mean, some of the stuff is very logical and fact-based, and then other gets into wild speculation and that kind of thing. And it's almost like a black hole, I think, for some people. It's that, like, they're never going to escape the compulsion to have an answer and think maybe they know the answer. One of the things I received from a reader is a poem about D.B. Cooper.
Speaking of.
Yes, and it addresses some of the very things you just talked about. And I wonder if I can read it.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, so this is a man, James Nystrom. He lives in the Seattle area and sent me this poem, which I thought was really, really quite interesting. It's called D.B. Cooper's Ghost. Your fantasy outlaw on the loose, I parachuted into America's psyche like some smoke jumper of dreams, tapping the public's fascination with my audacity and outright gall. I took your dirty money with me, down and probably out. Because no one found evidence of the effects of my perfect crime, I was destined to go into history as a legend after Bonnie and Clyde, after the Wild West was tamed, and after the boring Thanksgiving news blared out one exciting thing to know. People talked about the whole affair over turkey and dressing instead of politics, and never dreamed that hijackings would culminate in falling towers, would consummate in falling tears, would complete the end of innocence. After me, there are no airplane heroes, no more rogues in sky galleries, no charming criminals in the air. I am the ghost of D.B. Cooper, your conspiracy theory initiator. You're wondering if truth will out, your gap of knowledge of the past. Do not put out any more searchers. I have disappeared into the other ether, and there is nothing further to be done.
We'll be right back.
Support for the Mossback podcast comes from the Crosscut Festival, happening online and in Seattle May 4th through the 7th. Join us in celebrating bold ideas for a changing world at our biggest event of the year, featuring fireside conversations, panels, live podcast recordings, workshops, and special events that explore forward thinking in politics, social justice, the environment, history, innovation, and more. Spend your week with the community of the curious at the Crosscut Festival this spring. More information at crosscut.com/festival.
I was curious, do you know anything more about the people who have fingered their relatives and neighbors or made deathbed confessions? Do we know anything more about some of those stories?
So there is some evidence that, has surfaced that sort of feeds speculation. Some years ago, I think it was in the early 2000s, they were able to get some DNA information from the clip-on tie that was left behind. My understanding from the internet is that it was inconclusive. They didn't get a full DNA profile, and that they think there was DNA from more than one individual on the tie. So even if they had a full thing, there would perhaps be more than one. Another interesting thing is that the tie was tested, and they found some residue of titanium and some other chemicals and whatnot that lead some people to believe that the tie was worn in maybe an aircraft or defense manufacturing facility of some kind. So there are some little pieces of evidence. And of course, as technology moves ahead, as we learn more about DNA, there certainly is the possibility that, more information will come out. You can see this in history, with archaeological sites where, whereas many years ago we would just say, oh, it's a pile of bones. Mm-hmm. And now you can find out, if you're lucky and get enough DNA, you can find out an entire profile of a community, of an individual. So, we keep, people keep fingers crossed that maybe someday they'll get a definitive answer. From my perspective, I'm not, I just don't really care. Yeah, and people have been sending me their links or videos and telling me, to check them out, and I've checked them out, and some of them are more compelling than others. But yeah, it's just not, as my grandmother would say, it was not my dish of tea. One of the things is if you really get into it and try to analyze and compare everything, it's a full-time job, Well, so I was in high school. This was I was senior year of high school when this happened, and I was trying to remember, what did I think about it? And part of it's that over the years I've thought about it, I've read about it, and so it's hard to tell what I thought at the time. Mm-hmm. Although I remember hearing about it at the time, I remember talking about it with my friends and family a little bit, but we weren't overawed, and I realized there was so much else going on. When he jumped, we were in the middle of the Boeing recession. 1971 was when the billboard went up. I was draft age and was concerned about, one, where am I going to go to college? And two, am I going to end up in Vietnam? I was going to anti-war protests and that kind of thing. And so I think one thing I learned in thinking about it was just all this stuff that was happening at the same time. And it reminds me of our times where you have, whether it's election stuff or vaccination and pandemic stuff, there's just so much going on that it's hard for something else to break through. And I think for some people, especially because nobody got hurt in this thing except probably D.B. Cooper himself, I think there's a way that we like it because it didn't hurt. The passengers on the plane, the the pilots, everybody seemed to just kind of get on with life. Nobody really worried about the money. It was a form of entertainment that cut through all this stuff that we were angsting about. And that may be part of the kind of popularity of it is, you're not making a particularly politically incorrect or whatever statement by being fascinated by an old mystery that, the FBI hasn't been able to solve. So we're left with this conclusion that in a highly divided society, D.B. Cooper unites us.
That's right. Yeah. At the end of the day, that's the answer. Just money motivated heister. I guess, maybe it can be quite just as simple as it sounds. $200,000.
Yeah. Well, though it's interesting because you just reminded me of an aspect of the case that I didn't know about until I was digging around in it, which was that D.B. Cooper told the stewardess on the plane, who was his go-between with the pilots and whatnot, told her that he was doing it not because he had anything against the airline, but that he had a grudge.
Oh, really?
So that one little piece of motivation that he stated to the stewardess. And so when people are kind of creating a profile of D.B. Cooper, trying to figure out who he is, you're looking for somebody who had some knowledge of aircraft and parachuting, although some experts say, well, yeah, a little knowledge, but if he really knew what he was doing, he wouldn't have done what he did. But also there's this question of who was he trying to get back at, if that's true. There's one of the possible suspects is a guy who had a daughter who was killed in a hijacking that he believed the FBI had botched. And so one theory is that this guy had all the kind of knowledge and skills and access that would have answered the question of the grudge. It would have answered the question of the guy who was in aviation, had, various things. And so there is evidence that sort of has burbled to the surface or has been lost in the details that people who really follow this have paid attention to, that they can add to the picture. So if you add a little bit of DNA here and a grudge there and a titanium residue there, you begin to kind of have more kind of half puzzle pieces to play with.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. Well, the grudge, for me, the grudge really adds as a significant wrinkle because I think, a lot of the immediate press at the time and the sort of conversation around what the sociology professor thought, it was like a lot of it was like, oh, this is a simple thing. Like everybody can understand money, Yeah. And nobody was hurt. So that's, easier to get behind. But if you had a grudge.
Yes, right. Well, and, in the 1970s, who didn't have a grudge, people, they had grudges against Nixon. They had grudges against the war in Vietnam. They had grudges against the collapsed economy in Seattle, the Boeing recession. They had grudges, there were lots of opportunities for grudges. And that's kind of why I tie it to this time in that sense of the late 1960s and early 70s were tumultuous. And this may be partly a product of that and also partly a relief from that.
Huh. Well, anyway. Well, yeah, I'm just curious about this grudge now. Well,
okay. Well,
part of the enduring mystery.
Yeah, I was going to say I have opened a new rabbit hole for you.
Oh boy, I'm going to go home and just keep Googling now.
Will I ever see you for another podcast?
That's right. Never again. I'm just going to go to CooperCon and talk to you next year. Thanks for listening to Mossback. This episode was produced by me, Sarah Bernard, and the executive producer is Mark Baumgarten. Editorial assistance from Mason Bryan. Cover art by Greg Cohen. And many thanks to engineer Rusty Bacall for building out an amazing COVID-friendly audio studio. If you'd like to check out more videos from the 5 seasons of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them all at crosscut.com or kcts9.org. For more on all things Mossback, go to crosscut.com/Mossback. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen. And if you like the show, please review us. It really helps other people find us. And if you'd like to support the work we do at Crosscut, go to crosscut.com/membership. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to KCTS9's on-demand programming and a subscription to the Mossback Den newsletter, where Knute shares even more Pacific Northwest history. Mossback is a product of Cascade Public Media. I'm Sarah Bernard, and we'll be back soon with another episode. Were there any scenes or details that you and the team did kind of put together for the video that you ended up cutting?
In the final shoot, we had the stairs were down on this plane in Everett. There was a point where we experimented having me jump off the stairs kind of toward the camera. I mean, I was jumping from like the bottom stair, so it wasn't like a big leap or whatnot. And we nixed that, and instead I just did the thing where I take off my clip-on tie and throw it. But yeah, no, the me, flying through the air didn't make it.
Yeah. Oh, well.
Yeah.
Next time.